All right, so welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to class today. We are going to be covering Western Europe post-World War II. So sort of the rebuilding there, what happens in Western Europe and some of the issues and challenges that they're facing. From this point on, I'm going to try, and keep it a little bit more surface rather than the same level of depth that we've seen before. So I'm just going to try and present a little bit of highlights and some of the stories that I personally find of interest. So I want to start with this picture right here. This is a scene from Munich, from my last time I was in Germany. I went down to Bavaria and I got to see Munich and spend a few days there. And this is a park that's part of like the Olympic complex there in Munich. And I found it personally really very fascinating to see, because what you're seeing is a hill that's covered in greens, and at the very, very top of it, it's actually pretty steep of a hill. There are actual people standing at the very top there. I know it's difficult to see, so it's pretty massive, so you can get a sense of scale and how big it is and how far it goes back. But this hill is actually artificial. Underneath this is mounds upon mounds of rubble from World War II. And it's just one example of a lot of the destruction which we see Europeans having to face on how to rebuild after the war, and what do we need to do. Europe post-World War, and this is now the whole of Europe, there's been estimated that as many as 60 million people have been killed during this time of the war. There's poverty in every single country. There's a document that I use at times when we're in class where it talks about how even up until the 60s, to find like a piece of candy in England was a treat for this one family, right? There's a greater level of poverty. Rations continue into the early 50s in Western European countries, right? Recovery takes time. There's reduced items and reduced opportunities. We see poverty in every country. Entire cities and towns were completely destroyed. It's believed that 1,700 cities and towns, along with 70,000 villages, so smaller groups, were completely destroyed. The villages often never came back after this. And in addition, the culture of Europe is going to be transformed in that these new national identities are going to mean that many ethnic minorities in countries virtually have vanished. So in Germany, if you were any kind of ethnic minority, you're gone. There was forced movements. But in the same vein, in Poland, after the war, if you were of German descent, and a lot of Poland was made up of the former East Prussian state and other Prussian areas, you no longer were welcome there, and you were forced to move. And so we see a massive scale of a refugee crisis also occurring in Europe at this time, or just major movements of people across the whole country, across the whole continent. Now, in response to this, Europeans can't help themselves. They just can't. They don't have the funding. They don't have the energy. They don't have the materials. And so they have to become dependent upon outside forces. And this is how the Cold War comes into the homes of every single European. And some people in Europe come under the wing of the United States, and others in Europe are coming under the wing of the Soviet Union. And for our story today, I'm going to talk mainly about the relationship between the United States and the West. And on another podcast, I'll tell the story of the Soviet Union and the East. But to start, I want to talk about when that divide really became apparent and sort of the growing tensions of the Cold War. And so the Cold War itself just is a definition, right? It's diplomatic and ideological conflict, which determine the foreign policies between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the number one policy for the Soviet Union, as you know from your Yalta conference, is that they need to ensure that they have some kind of buffer state, some kind of extension of power beyond the Soviet Union to protect its interests. And so in Eastern Europe, they ensure the election of communist parties throughout the whole Eastern area. Germany itself is going to be punished in the Soviet Union's terms. And so Eastern Germany is going to be stripped of industry and equipment. They expect that they treat those equipment, those factories, as reparation payments in kind for the war. They also are going to really disagree with the treatment of Western Germany. They want to punish Germany and make sure it sort of disappears off the map, can never recover. And so when the Western areas, when France, England, and the United States start to create a unified area among their three different quadrants of Germany and create a new federal republic in West Germany in 1949, they're starting to merge the government, help Germany regrow. The Soviet Union takes direct threat to that. And they are not happy with the fact that now Western Germany is a solid country that's fairly sizable compared to East Germany. So in response to this, we're going to have a crisis in Berlin. Berlin becomes this leverage point for the Soviet Union. It's an island within itself, right? It's an island surrounded by Eastern Germany. And so Berlin, although half of it is still ruled by the West, and it's sort of a gateway for all Eastern Germans into the western part of Europe. The Soviet Union is going to use that area as a point of control, sort of a way of exerting, and flexing publicly to the West. So the Berlin blockade is the first example of this increased tension in an active way during the Cold War. What happens is Stalin cuts off all land routes to Berlin by the Soviets. And the response for the West was, well, if we can't drive in supplies, we will airlift them in. And so for over a year, 24 hours a day, the United States, England, and France, on a smaller scale, are going to be airlifting goods and supplies to those living in West Berlin. And it is an incredible achievement. I mean, every single thing that they needed was coming from them, because even a source of energy, they couldn't use the electricity from East Berlin. It wasn't permitted. So the generators needed coal that needed to be shipped in from the West. So every single thing, from medicine to milk to produce, anything that you can conceive in your day-to-day was shipped over. And this also includes building materials, because if you can see in this image here that I'm showing, there's the people standing there watching a plane coming in as they're standing upon the rubble. That's over them. Some things to note that are just interesting, I think pretty poignant. The airplanes are the same planes that were used to bomb Berlin and Germany during the war itself. And so it's a bit of a reversal in terms of who's the allies, how quickly they can turn the tide, right? What used to be the source of bombs is now going to be the source of food, and they also developed special chocolates that wouldn't melt. There was tropical chocolate. It had a higher melting point, so that way people could still have candies, and that was another part of sort of spreading goodwill that the West emphasized. The Soviet Union is also starting to, just as an aside here, because it connects to our next comment, the Soviet Union starts to also increase some influence in Greece and Turkey, primarily because the Soviet Union, as all Russian history always wants, is access to that Bosphorus Strait and controlling the Balkans. And so they are trying to sort of increase their control of the straits there, and there's a civil war occurring in Greece, which Stalin sort of uses the opportunity to spread communism there. Britain no longer has any kind of power and influence in these areas, and they can't control the Mediterranean as they had once prior. They're too weak. So the United States decides that it's their duty to respond. And so they respond with something called the Truman Doctrine, which is going to then in the future lead to the Monroe Doctrine. And it's a policy of containment. It's the belief that communism spreads amidst poverty, so therefore we need to contain, in order to contain communism, we also need to end the poverty and the misery that includes. And this is going to then lead us to the topic that will dramatically reshape Europe, which is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a funding process that the United States planned that was specifically to help rebuild the industry, infrastructure, and help develop the economic growth in Europe. The money was actually available to any country that was willing to receive it. It's the Soviet Union who adamantly refused and did not allow for any of the other Eastern satellite states to accept the funding from the United States. But it was a token of goodwill. It was offered to all countries. And it was grounded on the theory to help stop the spread of communism, which is why, of course, Stalin was not in favor of it. In order to receive the money, European countries had to be willing to reduce their tariffs and also loan to one another And so it helped encourage economic cooperation, which is setting up the groundwork for the European Union. So we can really see dramatic legacies from the Marshall Plan straight up to today. In order to spread that money and to sort of organize the Marshall Plan and distribute the funds, there was an organization created called the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, which once again helped instill this notion of economic cooperation across all the Western European countries. This was viewed in form of propaganda by the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe as the United States intervening and sort of running these countries like a puppet. And so no matter how critical we are of the Soviet Union and how they treated Eastern Europe, we were doing it in a similar but different way, right? Through economic means, we were funding and sort of influencing people. We made sure that in order to accept the money, you had to maintain capitalism in your society. You also had to be willing to buy American goods. You had to rely upon us and enter into a treaty with us in terms of peace and being an alliance. And so there were strings attached to our money, which helped us create strong allies in the West. In the same way that Stalin, although he doesn't use monetary investment, he will use force to encourage that. So a few years ago when I was in Germany, I got to visit a school that actually spent the day discussing the Marshall Plan, which was an interesting look because they actually were taking the lens of, I was actually in Eastern Germany at the time, so their education system's a bit localized, and they were looking at it in terms of a form of propaganda, that the Marshall Plan itself was a form of propaganda. And so this is an East German cartoon where you see the West German pointing at the East German, and the East German you can see the marionette is being used with a hand, but they're both saying, hey, you have strings, right, that you're both puppets. That Germany itself was sort of a puppet state at this time. It was an interesting commentary. And here we see other propaganda. The Cold War itself, because the war was never directly fought and never got hot, we can really describe it as a war of propaganda. And there's so many examples of this. Some of the famous symbols of Berlin is there's like a big TV tower. If you do a Google search for it, you'll be familiar with it. It's like there's like a big ball on top of a tower. And this you can see from all across all of Berlin. And it was in the East German side, and it was created to be so large that way it can transmit East German propaganda to all of Germany. And that kind of style has been happening over and over again throughout the whole Cold War. In order for the Marshall Plan to be enacted, or along with the enactment of the Marshall Plan, the United States also organizes the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which gets formed in 1949. And this is sort of viewed as like the umbrella over the Marshall Plan. Originally, there were 12 nations. Now there are 28. And the significance of NATO is it's the first permanent treaty that the United States ever entered into during peacetime. And it is setting up a collective security agreement where if you attack one of these nations, you're attacking all. Now, in response, but not in response right away, the Soviet Union will create the Warsaw Pact, which is a counterpart, but that's not created until 1955. And it was headed by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was the only voice of the Warsaw Pact. And that is the distinction between NATO and the Soviet Union's Warsaw Pact. Is NATO is an organization where all nations have member seats and can speak and negotiate with each other and request aid, whereas in the Warsaw Pact it is that the satellite states must follow the policy of the Soviet Union. So the Eastern European states by the 1950s do receive some economic aid from the Soviet Union in the form of something called Comecon, called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. But this is much more limited than what the Marshall Plan has, mainly because the Soviet Union itself can't afford it. Right? They suffered on a huge scale during this war. And so for their own people, they need to look out for, and they don't have the funds like the United States does to be able to help rebuild during this time. So the Marshall Plan, it's believed that there's a huge economic miracle that results from the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. It leads to huge economic growth. About $23 billion were spent within the 5 years. It also is going to lead to a lot of consumerism, as well as a baby boom within Western Europe. By the 1960s, the population is going to actually very much slow down. And from 1960s onward, we see a decreasing population growth within Europe. But up until 1960s, we do see a baby boom in Western Europe, just like how you see in the United States. Another result of the Marshall Plan is the exportation of American culture to Western Europe, as well as mass production of goods, a new standard of living. A lot of the technologies developed during World War II, such as radio, televisions, airplanes, and even the early computers start to get extended to the mass population. Along with those things, new attitudes about the future change and the consumer culture. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself there, but the consumer culture, where new synthetic fabrics allow for more things to be produced, the mention of plastics, all of these things are making more things available. Now, why in the world does Miss Rice have a Cinderella poster up there and then a picture of a Dior dress, skirt from Dior? This is part of that post-war consumerism, and I'm going to post this article on the link. It's a really interesting commentary. But Cinderella is the first Disney extended feature-length film created after World War II, and pretty much it was a risk that Disney was taking. If it had failed, he would have been out of business. And if you think about the imagery of Cinderella, the dress that she wears during the work time while she's cleaning is very much typical of a typical wartime dress that someone in Europe would have been wearing. And then the fact that her first dress was her mom's, that she was trying to sort of retrofit to make look more modern, very typical during wartime. And then this fairy godmother comes, the United States, and is able to give her all of this excess. And that big, big billowing skirt and all the frills that come along with it, and something so extravagant such as glass slippers that you can only wear this one night because they're way too painful. All of the symbolism is really encouraging this new way of life and encouraging increased spending. When you think of the 1950s, the typical fashions for women are those full skirts with the additional gatherings and pleats. And it's no accident, right? This is a time where we have excess, we have additionals, that you can have that additional wealth. And so it spreads through Western Europe, and we see a new reign of higher fashions and new styles that emphasize femininity. And we'll talk in a second about the position of women in the 50s and how they do get a sort of a setback from those changes. Now, this increased industrial growth in Western Europe is actually going to be encouraged through strong central bureaucracies. And we see the establishment of a mixed economy in all these places. We no longer see pure capitalism, nor is this a communist state, right? We see a lot of government-sponsored industry and a balance where there is certain social welfare programs that are supporting people and regulations over businesses. In order to open up the markets, they actually needed a lot more employers than they had within Western Europe. And in both Western Europe as well as in Eastern Europe, immediately following World War II, there's a lot of guest workers who move from one area of Europe to another, or even from other parts of the world into Europe. And it's the first time where we start to see a more immigrant culture within Europe, and identities start to get challenged. And so we see the influx of different guest workers or immigrants. The word guest worker is really an important term to keep in mind. They were never viewed as permanent. So some examples of this, as you can see here, there's Italian guest workers working in the coal mines of Western Germany, or a guest worker from Cuba working in an East German factory. These people would arrive within these areas and never gain their citizenship. And so to this day, they have had families, they've given birth to children, and those children do not get automatic citizenship within Germany. There's a real question of what does it mean to be a German versus what does it mean to be a foreigner within their own country. One common trend you'll see is in East German countries that have communist states, that's where they'll move to, is in East Germany, and in West Germany you have democratic states. There's a very large Turkish population within Germany. If you ever follow German soccer, there's quite a few famous Turkish soccer players on the teams, or Turkish descent, right? They are Germans. They are German citizens at this point, but the identities get very confused, and there's a lot of racism that comes with that within all of Europe, with these guest workers, of who belongs, who gets to be Italian, who gets to be German, who gets to be French. In East Germany, there's a strong Cuban population, but also Vietnamese population. So it's interesting to see the roles of these. And once again, as you can see in the back, there's a link I will post for you, so you can sort of see the groups. Okay. Along with guest workers, this new mixed economy, we're seeing the expansion of cradle-to-grave social welfare programs in the aftermath of World War II. And so there's new social programs provided from the government in areas such as healthcare, education, food services, for example, free milk giving out in schools, or old age pensions. And in some instances, we'll even see family allowances, sort of a minimum of material care for children. A lot of that was in part to help incentivize repopulating Europe and helping grow that population again. They also, these different social welfare groups are really eliminating the class barriers to good jobs that now they're opening up education to all. So we're seeing greater social mobility. The world of Europe from before the war to after is very, very much changed. The guest workers are going to be cheaper laborers than your typical European employer, which is also going to challenge the labor unions, particularly in places like England that had a strong union history. Unions are going to be greatly weakened, and some are going to even become obsolete within factories, and there's going to be a lot of confrontation in those areas. So all of these economic transformations are challenging the status quo within Europe. One area in particular that gets challenged is gender roles during this time. Who's going to be getting aid? When it comes to these family allowances, there comes to be a question of, should women be categorized as mothers, or should they be equally treated as men? And different countries treat this differently. So let me illustrate. For the British welfare system, if you were a stay-at-home mom, you would receive a subsidy from the government. If you worked, you did not get that subsidy. And this was encouraging women to stay home once they had children. It gave them incentives to stay home. And it also encouraged employers to pay women less than men. West Germany is actually going to do a very similar policy. They're going to try, and the reason why they do that is to purposely distinguish themselves from the communist government in East Germany, which provided full daycare for all children and sort of expected that women work and go to work and expected that equality. So sort of a mixed bag here, right? They were promoting motherhood by funding and giving supports, but also not allowing women to have a choice there, really, by giving a lot of pressure. In France will actually provide monetary assistance for stay-at-home moms as well as daycare for working moms. So in France, there is two different options. So every country sort of decides differently how to handle it. All of these social welfare programs by the 1970s is going to be facing a crisis because as finances become a lot tighter in the 70s, particularly with the oil crisis, and there's a recession, budgets become much tighter, and people start to question these different policies, these social welfare policies. One trend that I want to just talk about, because I think it's neat, is these maternity packs. When in a lot of European countries, to this day, when you give birth to a baby, they give you this little box filled with, baby's clothes and diapers, a book on how to raise the child, and all sorts of different things within it. And then the box itself serves a purpose to be a place to serve as a crib for the baby, to help prevent, laying the baby beside you and accidentally smothering the baby at night. So this is one example of sort of a social welfare program that's actually gaining a lot of traction today in the United States. Certain urban areas in particular are offering maternity packs for new moms when they take home their child. So in addition to these economic shifts that are occurring in Europe, another major economic shift is the loss of the colonies. And it's also a shock to Europeans' identity. They had been an imperial power. The sun never set on the British Empire. The French empires, the colonies were a big source of their pride. And by the 1950s, there's massive decolonization movements across the colonies, sort of demanding their freedom. And so we see independence for many African and Asian territories. However, these are going to be delayed over time. European powers are very reluctant to lose their colonies. And so they'll actually continue language like, you're not capable of ruling yourself yet, you're not ready, to help sort of argue against this independence. But gradually over time, we'll see India gain its independence through the Indian National Congress and the work of Gandhi. In Algeria, there's a very dramatic war that occurs. I mentioned this in class, how Algeria was viewed as sort of an extension of France, and for the French people, it was viewed very much as part of its country. And so this independence movement was turned to a lot of violence, and it became a bloody civil war. Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam, as you also know, was not a very peaceful exchange, and contributed to the United States' involvement in the Vietnamese War. And then Sukarno setting up a dictatorship in Indonesia is another part of this factors of decolonization. But overall, there's a lot of concerns over the Cold War, as well as the instability in these nations, and what's the long-lasting responsibility. As these nations have continued to grow, what's the role of Europe in terms of supporting those countries to this day in their economic development and in their industries? Right. So what's the relationship there? In terms of politics after the war for England, immediately after the war, actually during the peace negotiations at Potsdam, you have a Labour Party member win the election. So between 1945 and 1951, Attlee is the prime minister, and he's setting up a welfare state there. He nationalizes the banks and industries, including coal, aviation, gas, electricity, rail, and steel. And he's going to expand the social insurance program. One of the great achievements at this time is the National Health Act, right? So everyone ends up having universal health care. However, it's still really struggling to rebuild, and the loss of colonies makes a very significant hit to the British government, to their economy. And so there ends up becoming a lot of austerity measures within England during this time to help sort of maintain some kind of economic balance, which is going to contribute to a lot of major strikes. And so from the 1940s to the 1990s, we see a lot of debate between the Labour and Conservative parties. And so in 1951, the Conservatives come into power for the next 12 years. And then after that, we have the Labour Party coming back in for a period of time until the 1970s recession hits. Amidst that recession that began in 1974 and rising in inflation, Labour membership is going to decline. And so this is a great poster. I just think it's pretty effective marketing campaign here, where you see labor isn't working and the double meaning of that, right? That laborers are not working. They're all online for the unemployment office, but also that the political party itself just isn't working out for the British people. And the idea that Britain is better off with the Conservatives. This campaign poster is from the 1978 election, which ushers in Margaret Thatcher coming in and winning the election for England. And so she's going to maintain Conservative control over England starting in 1979 straight through the 80s. And it's not until Tony Blair, who's elected in 1997, that we see the new Labour Party emerge. And he's going to then increase spending for education, but start to impose tuition fees for higher education. So he's not a true Labour Party member, as you would have seen earlier. So it's this new Labour that's trying to balance different policies. In terms of France, France is going to go through quite a few different political upheavals immediately following World War II. So when France was invaded during Germany, that was the fall of the Third Republic during World War II itself. So when the Third Republic became ruled by Vichy and the puppet state that was ruled there under Nazi rule technically, that party could no longer exist after the war. So the Third Republic ends with World War II. And so immediately after World War II, they create the Fourth Republic. Now, this Fourth Republic is only going to last until 1958 because it's a very weak government. It actually was the same exact government as the Third Republic, but post-World War II, there are many different small parties with a very weak ceremonial presidency. And so actually, Charles de Gaulle was the original president of this Fourth Republic, but he steps down frustrated by the weakness of the role of the presidency. And so during this time of the Fourth Republic, we see the left wing dominate. And communist socialists, along with liberal Catholics, are going to be the ones running the government. The conservative groups were viewed as collaborators with Nazi Germany. So in the 50s, France is really struggling with who's guilty, who's culpable of participating and collaborating during the war versus who's members of the resistance. And the weakening of the empire doesn't help their cause. They're going to be fighting different wars to try and maintain their empire. They're not peacefully letting go. Finally, amidst the Algerian crisis, which was really the pinnacle of this cause of change, Charles de Gaulle is invited back into power to help sort of settle all of these different problems. And when he comes in, he says he'll accept the role of president only if France agrees to change its government to a different form. And so it's then that Charles de Gaulle forms the Fifth Republic. And he originally comes into power for 6 months as an emergency premier. And then from that point on, with the new constitution in 1958, they develop a strong presidency created by the constitution with a 7-year term and 5-year term for members of the National Assembly. So actually, if you are president of France, you're in term longer. You don't have to face an election as often as members of their assembly. Some of the initiatives of de Gaulle were to strengthen France itself. He used nationalism for his own cause. He was, just as a background, I'm sorry I didn't even mention this, Charles de Gaulle was the head of the resistance, the French resistance during the war. So France during World War II actually had 3 governments. It had, northern France was ruled by the Nazis, so it had the Nazi government itself. It had Vichy France, which was its puppet state in the southern areas of France. And then Charles de Gaulle's resistance, French resistance. So he's viewed as like the hero of the French Revolution, of the hero of World War II, and then this representative of what it means to be French. He is more conservative, although it's clear because of his active work with the resistance that he is not a person who had been a conspirator with the Nazi government. So de Gaulle's reign, and that's the best way to describe it, is viewed to be the uncrowned Republican monarch. Right? He used a lot of direct appeals to the people. However, the people themselves are still facing a lot of challenges, and they're not happy with his rule, particularly the young people. He is coming from an older legacy of France that maybe isn't really reflecting all the different needs and challenges of the time. So there's problems with housing, inflation, the new nuclear works, and he starts to try and balance all of these different types of issues. In May 1968, while he is in power, there's a major protest among the French university students. 1968 is a time of protest throughout all of Europe, along with the United States. It's here that we have the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, and in the United States, this is when you have groups like the Black Panther movement. It's also when Columbia University gets taken over by the student union there. And so this revolt really is it was a revolt of university students demanding changes and updates to the university system, along with a strike that was joined by 10 million workers. And so France was in the midst of an economic collapse. And so de Gaulle responds by promising wage increases, education, labor reforms, and sort of allowing for more social welfare supports in France. And so de Gaulle ends up declaring a referendum the next year in April of 1969 and steps down after he loses a referendum calling for constitutional changes to sort of centralize his rule even more. In terms of Germany after World War II, Germany, Western Germany, is facing the threat along the border itself. Its economy is going to really grow in an incredible way. A lot of that is because they don't spend a single penny on defense. All of their defense is coming from the United States. So they can then focus on developing their industries and rebuilding in that way. And they cooperate strongly with the West. They end up becoming a member of NATO in 1955, and they are allowed to arm and to rearm. And the official occupation of the war is also ended in 1955 because of the increasing tension with the Soviet Union. Western Germany will also start getting nuclear weapons in during this time. The capital of this new Federal Republic of Germany is going to be in a small little city with really no significance called Bonn. And the reason why is because the official capital of West Germany will still be Berlin. West Germany refuses to accept that Germany will remain split for the rest of their time. So they choose a city that really is not anything very special because they never plan on staying there permanently. So it's just the de facto capital with the hope of reunification with East Germany. And as the political progressions move forward, you'll see different leaders of Germany sometimes work more with the West and other times really try and reach out to the Eastern German chancellor to try and get them on the same page to work together and collaborate. So those members, the Christian Democratic Party was a political party that led politics from 1949 to 1963. That's actually what Angela Merkel is as well. So they have long periods of time in power. And they're going to really strongly cooperate with the West and emphasize capitalism and economic and political integration. Then between 1969 and 1974, we have the Social Democratic Party, which has more socialist leanings. And so they're more looking towards working with East Germany and the Ostpolitik. And they agree to a non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union. They recognize post-World War II Polish and Soviet Union borders. And in 1973, East and West Germany, for the first time, recognize that each other exist. So with those actions, Willy Brandt will actually win the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, for those moments. So that's where we'll stop for the day. I just want to illustrate those different countries and some of the challenges that are facing the modern areas. I hope you guys are all doing well. Take care.